Let's talk about the Roman Gladius. This here is a reproduction made by Raven Armory in the mid-90s. It appears to be a Mainz type Gladius, which you could say is the most iconic. Many people believe that this is an exclusive thrusting sword, not used for cutting at all. And many of the historical sources emphasize the thrust. However, there are also a few that mention cutting. So I want to talk a little bit about its use, cutting versus thrusting specifically. Unfortunately, we don't have any actual martial arts manuals from antiquity. There are some descriptions of how recruits were trained and how Roman armies in general fought. But instructional material wasn't written down before the Middle Ages, or at least we don't have anything like that. So it's a lot of speculation, but let's take a look at some of the sources we have. There's one particular late Roman writer, Flavius Vegetius Renatus, or Vegetius in the English version, who wrote around 390 CE. So that is not long before the decline of the Roman Empire. In fact, it was the beginning of the end, if you will. And this summarizes what most people think about the gladius as a dedicated thrusting weapon. They were taught not to cut but to thrust with their swords. A stroke with the edges, though made with ever so much force, seldom kills, as the vital parts of the body are defended both by the bone and armor. Also, it says, it is impossible to avoid exposing the right arm and side, but on the other hand, the body is covered while a thrust is given and the adversary receives the point before he sees the sword. I find this interesting because it was written at a time when the spada was already established, which is a longer Roman sword, which was originally used as a cavalry sword and then later replaced the gladius for infantry as well. And you can consider that to be a dedicated cutting sword. But this talks mainly about thrusting. He was talking about an earlier point in time when Rome was more powerful and when they fought differently. So that makes sense. But interestingly, there are other sources that describe the fighting in earlier periods which do mention cuts, whereas Vegetius really talks about the thrust exclusively. We have Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who wrote about 400 years earlier, and in the Roman Antiquities, published in 7 BCE, he describes Marcus Manlius in a fight with attacking Gauls. He says, the one of them who had ascended first and was bringing his sword down over Manlius's head, he forestalled by striking him on the arm and cutting off his forearm. Obviously, severing limbs requires a sword that is certainly not deficient at cutting. But in the same text, there are definitely more references to thrusting, so it does seem more common. There's also a description of how Romans in general fought. Holding their swords straight out, they would strike their opponents in the groin, pierce their sides, and drive their blows through their breasts into their vitals. And if they saw any of them keeping these parts of their bodies protected, they would cut the tendons of their knees or ankles and topple them to the ground, which clearly makes a lot of sense. And then we've got another writer, Titus Livius, or Livy, in the History of Rome, book 31, written sometime between 31 BCE and 12 CE. He says, Philip's men, meaning the soldiers of Philip V of Macedon, who had been accustomed to fighting with Greeks and Illyrians and had only seen wounds inflicted by javelins and arrows, and in rare instances by lances. But when they saw bodies dismembered with a Spanish sword, arms cut off from the shoulder, heads struck off from the trunk, bowels exposed, and other horrible wounds, they recognized the style of weapon and the kind of man against whom they had to fight, and a shudder of horror ran through their ranks. The so-called Spanish sword, Gladius Hispaniensis, gladius simply means sword in Latin, was actually a predecessor to the Mainz gladius. Looked fairly similar in that it also had a bit of a leaf-shaped blade, but it was a little longer, and that would definitely be an effective cutting sword. Livy and Polybius tell us that the Iberians in their battle against Hannibal at Cannae in 216 BCE used a sword that was useful for thrusting as well as cutting, and that was not considered a Spanish sword. So from what I understand, that would be something like this, a Mainz gladius. Polybius around 150 BCE compared Romans and Gauls, saying the Gaulish sword being only good for a cut and not for a thrust. The Romans, on the contrary, instead of slashing, continued to thrust with their swords, which did not bend, the points being very effective. The very same author also says about Roman hastati, they also carry a sword hanging on the right thigh and called a Spanish sword. This is excellent for thrusting, and both its edges cut effectually as the blade is very strong and firm. So it appears that around the same time the Romans still used the Gladius Hispaniensis, which they consider to be a better cutting sword, but also the Mainz type, which they consider more suitable for thrusting specifically. Of course, I'm not a historian, so if I got any of the details wrong, feel free to correct me. But let's talk about the practical implications of a blade like this. Having used this for cutting tests, I would definitely not say that it's not suitable for cutting. In fact, it is quite a good cutter. It surprised me just how well it cut when I sharpened it properly. That a dedicated leaf blade like the Hispaniensis would cut really well is obvious, because if you widen the blade towards the point, you shift the balance a little away from the handle and you give the blade more mass towards its final section and thereby more momentum in the swing. In case of this blade type, the leaf shape is quite different. It does widen right before the point here, but at the base it's even wider. So that suggests that it's designed more with thrusting in mind. Also because the drawn out point can more easily enter into a ring of mail armor and then just break it apart. Whereas a more rounded, wider point like this is more likely to contact multiple rings at once, so it will distribute the force. With this more strongly tapered point, you can see that it can partially slip through one single ring and then apply its pressure onto that one. So against armor with a blade type like this, thrusts would undoubtedly be more effective, but against unprotected parts like limbs and throats, for instance, cuts could be quite devastating, so you really shouldn't underestimate the ability of this sword to cut. A later Gladius, the Pompeii type, has parallel edges and a point that is not tapered like that. So in that case, it's debatable if that would be used primarily for thrusting or cutting. I would imagine cuts being more common with that type of blade, but it's hard to tell exactly how they use them. It's reasonable to assume that the practice varied between different time periods and with different blade types. But in general, I doubt that there was any particular period where they really did absolutely nothing but thrusts and never used any cuts whatsoever. Cutting to the legs to sever the tendons makes a lot of sense regardless of blade type and may be a viable tactic. Therefore, I'd say it's inaccurate to call the Gladius an exclusive thrusting sword, even in case of the Mainz type, especially considering how well it really does in actual cutting tests. And that's it, so I hope you found this interesting and thanks for watching.